Hey everybody, this is chapter 13 of Z.A. Jordan's The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, Philosophical and Sociological Analysis. The title of chapter 13 is The Concept of Scientific Socialism. So here we go. The examination of the relation of historical materialism to dialectical materialism has invalidated the view that according to Marx and Engels, the former is an extension or conclusion from the latter. That historical materialism is an extension or conclusion from dialectical materialism. Only Lenin and Stalin asserted that there exists a logically valid transition from the basic assumptions of dialectical materialism to the fundamental premises of historical materialism. Since they also maintain that the advance of scientific knowledge increasingly confirms the truth of dialectical materialism, the deducibility of historical materialism from dialectical materialism transformed the materialist interpretation of history into, quote, the only scientific conception of history, end quote. The view that Marx and Engels did not consider historical materialism as a continuation of dialectical materialism may be challenged on the grounds that Marx and Engels are the founders of scientific socialism, and scientific socialism is an application of the materialist conception of history to human affairs. However, Marxian socialism could not be described as scientific by its founders unless the theory of which it is an application were regarded by them as something more than a mere hypothesis. The socialism of Marx and Engels was scientific because Marx and Engels based their socialism upon historical materialism, which Marx and Engels established as a comprehensive scientific theory and which explained the transition of one socioeconomic formation into another. Whereas historical materialism gave to the socialism of Marx and Engels' socialism's scientific character, the truth of historical materialism itself was guaranteed by the truth of dialectical materialism. To answer this objection, it is necessary to trace down the history of the term and to analyze the concept of scientific socialism. Apart from the light that this task may shed on the problem at hand, it should help to expose a few more legends which tend to grow and accumulate around the name of Marx. New section. Section 1. The vicissitudes of the term scientific and the term being scientific socialism. In spite of the widespread belief that Marx himself gave the name of scientific socialism to Marx's doctrine, this expression, scientific socialism, as distinct from the concept, is hardly to be found in Marx at all. While Engels used scientific socialism occasionally and marginally in the early 70s, Engels applied the term scientific socialism as an appropriate designation of the Marxian socialism only in anteduring, from which Engels took it as the title of one of his most successful publications, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, but even when Marx did not adopt Engels' use of this expression as his own. Marx appears to have conceived an intense dislike for the term, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, at the very beginning of Marx's career, and Marx did not get rid of it, the term scientific socialism, that intense dislike for the term scientific socialism until the end of his life. The expression, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, was coined by Proudhon, and Marx may have come upon the expression scientific socialism for the first time in Proudhon. Some footnotes that I missed. It says, first footnote, for instance, Edward Bernstein wrote that, quote, the theory of society worked out by Marx and Engels, bracket, was, end bracket, called by them, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, end quote. And the next footnote says, Marx seemed to have used the expression, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, only once or twice, and in French, namely in the introduction to Engels' Socialisme utopique et Socialisme scientifique, which he wrote in 1880, and which Lafargue edited and published under his own name the same year. See Marx-Engels Werke. The other occurrence of the expression is to be found in the letter to F.A. Zorga of the 5th of November 1880, where Marx inserts it in its French formulation, Socialisme moderne scientifique, The expression, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, occurred marginally in Engels, and is used in its technical sense only in Anti-Düring. Back to the text. Quote, scientific socialism, end quote, and other similar expressions such as, quote, Deutsche Wissenschaft des Sozialismus, end quote, German science of socialism, end parenthesis, and, quote, philosophische Begründung des Sozialismus, end quote, philosophical foundation of socialism, end parenthesis, were introduced into German by Karl Grün in his book Die soziale Bewegung in Frankreich und Belgien, published in 1845 and savagely criticized by Marx in the third part of the German ideology. According to Wikipedia, Karl Theodor Ferdinand Grün lived from 1817 to 1887. Karl Grün, also known by his alias Ernst von der Heide, was a German journalist, philosopher, political theorist, and socialist politician. Karl Grün played a prominent role in the radical political movements which led up to the Revolution of 1848 and participated in the revolution. Karl Grün was an associate of Heinrich Heine, Ludwig Feuerbach, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Karl Marx, Mikhail Bakunin, and other radical political figures of the era. Although less widely known today, Grün was an important figure in the German Vormärz, young Hegelian philosophy, and the democratic and socialist movements in 19th century Germany. As a target of Marx's criticism, Grün played a role in the development of early Marxism. Through his philosophical influence on Proudhon, Karl Grün had a certain influence on the development of French socialist theory. End footnote. Alongside Moses Hess, Karl Grün is the best-known representative of so-called true socialism. Wahrer Sozialismus, a trend of utopian, radical social thought inspired by French socialism, which appeared in Germany in the early 40s and which itself claimed to have been based on, quote, science, end quote. It was Moses Hess who first introduced both Marx and Engels to French socialism and secured the invitation of Marx to the editorial board of Weinische Zeitung in 1842. Karl Grün described the doctrine of Saint-Simon as a seed pot containing the germs of many things, among them the first intimations of, quote, scientific socialism, for Saint-Simon spent his whole life in search for the new science, end quote. Karl Grün. While Marx acknowledged Grün's claim that Saint-Simon, quote, searched after a new social science and after new social laws, end quote, which were to create the conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat, Marx added that Saint-Simon searched for them because of the undeveloped state of the proletariat at that time, which thus did not yet reveal itself as a historical force destined to transform the world. Marx saw in Saint-Simon not a pioneer of scientific socialism, but a utopian, deceived by his own fantastic conceptions, and Saint-Simon's sense of superiority to all class antagonisms. To all class antagonism, singular. Marx despised Karl Grun and attacked Karl Grun piteously as a bombastic petty bourgeois Philistine, an indolent imitator of Louis Ribot and Lorenz von Stein, only capable of producing a, quote, silly echo, end quote, of the French ideas, and lost, in spite of his pride in the matchless German science, in, quote, the misty realm of philosophical fantasy, end quote. Footnote. Engels, in his Ludwig Feuerbach, more than 40 years later, spoke of, quote, true socialism, end quote, with a similar and undiminished contempt. One second, I'm looking someone up.
Louis Ribot.
Louis Ribot. Marie Roche Louis Ribot lived from 1799 to 1879 and was a French writer, political economist, and politician. Louis Ribot was born in Marseille. End footnote. Or back to the text, I guess I should say. Marx's fierce anger and scorn for Karl Grun may have been increased by the fact that from 1844 on, quote, true socialism, end quote, was gaining support among the bourgeoisie in many parts of Germany. Footnote. See Engels' unpublished article, Die Wahlen Sozialisten, written at the beginning of 1847, and Franz Mehring's Karl Marx, page 112. Later in his life, Marx recognized that he overestimated the significance of, quote, true socialists, end quote, who represented only a local, that is, a German movement. See Marx's letter to Engels of 15th of April, 1869. Back to the text. Moreover, at that time, and for a long time to come, Marx and Engels avoided being described as socialists. Quote, socialist and, quote, socialism were terms induced into the French and English language only in the 1830s, and into the German language even later, becoming firmly established in Germany owing to the success of Lorenz von Stein's book Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs in 1842. Footnote. See Karl Grünberg's Der Ursprung der Worte Sozialismus und Socialist, and G.D.H. Cole's A History of Socialist Thought, Volume 1. Quote, socialism, end quote, made its first appearance in the French language in the Saint-Simonist periodical Le Globe in 1832, where it was used as the opposite of, quote, individualism, end quote, parenthesis, while in English, socialism was just a synonym of, quote, Owenism, or, quote, social reform, end quote, although it was believed that Owenism favored the, quote, community of property, end quote, end parenthesis. In Polish, the author's native tongue, the word, quote, socialism, end quote, was first used by the Poles who escaped to France and England after the collapse of the insurrection of 1830. In English, French, and Polish, the word was the same, but the concept was very different. End footnote. Louis Reboux and Lorenz von Stein were also responsible for conferring the title, quote, socialist, end quote, above all on three social thinkers, Saint-Simon, parenthesis, and the Saint-Simonists, end parenthesis, Charles Fourier. I want to see how you say Charles. I always never know how to say Charles in French. I feel like it's the same, but I don't know. Let's see. Since I have the French translator open, I'll look it up.
Charles. Charles. Charles.
Charles. Charles. Charles Fourier and Robert Owen. That is exactly on those three social writers whom Marx later described as the, quote, founders of critical utopian socialism and communism, end quote, and whose disciples were increasingly becoming, in Marx's opinion, fanatical sectarians given to the construction of castles in the air. Footnote. According to G.D.H. Cole, the term, quote, utopian socialist, end quote, was apparently first used by J. Blanqui in his History of Political Economy, published in 1839, which was well known to Marx, parenthesis, he quoted it repeatedly in theories of surplus value, end parenthesis. But Blanqui probably had it from Louis Reboux, who published three comprehensive studies, namely Les Saint-Simoniens, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen, in the Revue des Deux Mondes of 1836 to 1838. These three studies appeared in book form under the title Les Socialistes Modernes in 1840. End footnote. Louis Reboux wrote in 1843 that socialism, as understood by these social writers, was the, quote, act of improving irreproachable societies, end quote. Their socialism hardly needed any refutation and was doomed to painless extinction, for no sensible person believed in the existence of a perfect social system and in a sudden transformation of man and society. Marx and Engels entirely agreed with Reboux's evaluation of utopian ideologies. A perfect society can exist only in the imagination, for all real historical societies are transitory and mere stages in the endless course of development from the lower to the higher. Having to choose between the title of socialist or communist, Marx and Engels decided to adopt the title communist rather than the socialist. Communism, even a utopian communism, was superior to socialism because, in contradistinction to socialism, communism was a, quote, spontaneous workers' communism, end quote. Engels. Like Proudhonism, utopian and doctrinaire socialism was a, quote, false brother, end quote, of communism. Its very name should be shunned and avoided. The sharp boundary line between the two is very apparent not only in the title but also in the content of Engels' Principles of Communism and in the Communist Manifesto. Many years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto, Engels explained that about the middle of the 19th century, socialism and communism were clearly differentiated from each other. Socialists were the adherents of the various utopian systems, notably the followers of Owen in England and Fourier in France, as well as the multifarious groups called by Engels, quote, social quacks, end quote, and by Marx, quote, socialist miracle workers, end quote. That is, those who wish to redress all sorts of social grievances by reforms alone. Socialism was at that time an essentially middle-class and respectable movement, and its protagonists and supporters were mostly intellectuals. Footnote. This is true of the Saint-Simonists and also the French socialists and utopian communists. The leading, quote, communists, end quote, in the 1848 revolution in France, quote, Louis Blanc, Louis-Auguste Blanqui, Etienne Cabet, François Raspail, were all middle-class professional men and intellectuals, and only Alexandre Martin, parenthesis, Albert, in parenthesis, was a worker. See also Engels' preface to the first German edition of... Sorry, he has all these abbreviations. I can't keep track of them. CWC. End footnote. This applied equally to the French and English socialism of the 40s. Engels emphasized that socialism in England in the 1840s was a bourgeois movement, quote, thoroughly tame and peaceable, end quote. It accepted the existing social order and proceeded with great consideration toward the bourgeoisie and its ruthless methods of control over the proletariat. Such socialism could never become the common creed of the working class. On the other hand, that section of the working class which rejected the idea that socialism can be achieved by peaceful means and demanded a radical reconstruction of society, for instance, the followers of Cabet in France and Weitling in Germany and Switzerland, the League of the Just and the Workers' Educational Association called themselves communists. Footnote. The Open Educational Society associated with the secret League of the Just, founded by the German craftsmen in London in 1840, called itself the Communist Workers' Educational Association, parenthesis, Kommunistische Arbeiterbildungsverein. It was, Engels continued, a, quote, crude, rough-hewn, purely instinctive sort of communism, end quote, based on the belief that equality and justice would overcome every obstacle. But it was a working-class movement and, in the public opinion, the very opposite of respectability, parenthesis, hence the phrase about a, quote, specter, end quote, parenthesis, Gespenst, end parenthesis, haunting Europe, opening the Communist Manifesto, end parenthesis, quote, as our notion, end quote, from the very beginning was that, quote, the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself, end quote, end quote. Engels wrote, quote, there could be no doubt as to which of the two names, parenthesis, that is, socialist or communist, end parenthesis, we must take, end quote. Footnote. In this connection, it should be remembered that the original title of the Communist Manifesto was the Manifesto of the Communist Party. The Communist Manifesto's purpose was to present to the world the views and aims of a party that was no longer a conspiratorial secret society, and although numerically weak, was a working-class international movement dedicated to the realization of a revolutionary reconstruction of society. Engels' views about the differences between communism and socialism and about their respective reputation in the 1840s were confirmed by what Lorenz von Stein or Louis Reyboud, for instance, have to say about communism. See Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs. End footnote. Marx's use of the term, quote, communism and, quote, socialism did not deviate from that indicated by Engels. Marx declared his preference for, quote, communism, end quote, parenthesis, and occasionally, quote, revolutionary socialism, end quote, or, quote, materialistic critical socialism, end quote, end parenthesis, because unlike the socialists, the first communists in France and England endorsed materialism and thus showed themselves, quote, more scientifically minded, end quote, than their socialist contemporaries. End footnote. There's no footnote, sorry. Above all, they were aware of the reality of class war and ready to abolish the property relations and the relations of production in which class war rested. Quote, the theory of the communist, end quote, stated the Communist Manifesto, quote, may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property, end quote. Footnote. Nearly 25 years later, the same definition of communism was given by Marx in the Civil War in France. The phrase, end footnote, the phrase Aufhebung des Privateigentum is new. The utopian communists spoke of the community of goods, Gute Gemeinschaft, and Communauté des biens. Writing almost 50 years later, Engels emphasized that the definition of communism as the striving for the abolition of private property, parenthesis, the Communist Manifesto, end parenthesis, or for the abolition of wage labor and capital, parenthesis, the class struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, end parenthesis, sharply differentiated, quote, modern workers, end quote, socialism, both from all the different shades of feudal, bourgeois, petty bourgeois, etc. socialism, as well as from the confused community of goods of utopian and spontaneous workers' communism, end quote. Footnote. Engels, preface to Class Struggle in France. The definition of communism to be found in the Communist Manifesto was first formulated by Engels in Grundsätze des Kommunismus, Principles of Communism. End footnote. The immediate aim of communism was, according to the Communist Manifesto, the organization of the proletariat into a class, the overthrow of bourgeois supremacy, and the conquest of political power by the proletariat. This formulation follows and improves on the definition of communism given by Engels 2 years earlier. Quote, footnote, quote, I defined the objects of communists in this way. 1. To achieve the interests of the proletariat in opposition to those of the bourgeoisie. 2. To do this through the abolition of private property and its replacement by a community of goods. 3. To recognize no means of carrying out these objectives other than a democratic revolution by force, end quote. Parenthesis, Engels' letter to the Communist Correspondence Committee, letter number 3, Paris, 23rd of October, 1846, quoted in Marx Engels Selected Correspondence, 1846 to 1895. End footnote. Defined in terms of its political program, communism was surely something quite different from the socialism to be found in the treatises of the contemporary socialist writers and the practice of the first socialist politicians and political leaders, like Louis Blanc, member of the provisional government in France after the February Revolution. In the books The Class Struggle in France, 1848 to 1850, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the terms, quote, socialism and, quote, communism were used by Marx on the whole in keeping with Engels' distinction. It is true that in these writings the term, quote, socialism and, quote, glitters with many meanings, including an ironic use, calling everything that offended the interests of the party of order or formulated the demands of the opposition, irrespective of the appropriateness of this designation, by the name of socialism. Where am I? But the boundary line between, quote, socialism and, quote, communism was essentially clear. On the one hand, there were, quote, the socialist doctrinaires of the proletariat, end quote, the proletariat's real revolutionaries, end quote, on the other. Marx related the former writers and politicians like Alexandre Ledru-Rollin, Alphonse Lamartine, or Louis Blanc, to the founders of socialist sects, that is, probably to Fourier and Proudhon. Marx described them as, quote, the half-conservative, half-revolutionary, and wholly utopian reformers, end quote, and as representatives of a, quote, mass hovering between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, a mass whose material interests demanded democratic institutions, end quote. Marx, Class Struggle in France. Quote, socialism, end quote, means here what in the Communist Manifesto Marx called, quote, petty bourgeois and, quote, conservative, or, quote, bourgeois, end quote, socialism. Quote, the proletariat's real revolutionaries, end quote, were supporters of communism for which their bourgeois opponents invented the name, quote, Blanquism, end quote. Louis-Auguste Blanqui, together with Etienne Cabet, François Raspail, and Alexandre Martin, Albert, was the leader of the revolutionary proletariat, a section of the workers to be distinguished not only from the petty bourgeois and bourgeois socialists, but also from their working class supporters. The socialists in the Marxian terminology believed in the peaceful attainment of their aims, which were to be achieved by an application of a socialist system, hence their connection with the utopian socialist proper, and their differentiation from the communists who have, quote, no ready-made utopias to introduce par décret du peuple. Peuple? I don't know how to say that. Let's see.
Par décret du peuple. Par décret du peuple.
Peuple. Ooh.
Peuple.
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 Doesn't sound right to me, but you just have to accept their word for it. Anyway. Which means, in that phrase, though, means decree of the people. By decree of the people. Excuse me. So let me repeat that sentence. The socialists in the Marxian terminology believed in the peaceful attainment of their aims, which were to be achieved by an application of a socialist system, hence their connection with the utopian socialist proper, and their differentiation from communists who have, quote, no ready-made utopias to introduce, par l'écrit du peuple, which means by decree of the people. The communists, as described by Marx, were committed to the overthrow of the social and political order prevailing in France after the February Revolution, to the establishment of the class dictatorship of the proletariat, and to the abolition of class distinction. It is a fact little noted that the term, quote, socialism, end quote, does not even occur in capital. Also, Marx's correspondence in the last 20 years of his life and his critique of the Gotha program clearly indicate that while he relented somewhat, he never got rid of his dislike for the term, quote, socialism, end quote. Footnote. See in particular Marx's letter to F.A. Zorga of the 5th of November 1850 and to F. de Melle Nieuwenhuis of 22nd of February 1881.
Domela Nieuwenhuis. Domela Nieuwenhuis.
Domela Nieuwenhuis. See in particular Marx's letter to F.A. Zorga, 5th of November 1880, and to F.L. Domela Nieuwenhuis of the 2nd of February 1881. Also, Engels expressed his preference for the term, quote, communism over, quote, socialism as late as 1887, parenthesis. That is at the time when socialism changed entirely, parenthesis, as compared with utopian socialism of the past, end parenthesis, and was clearly recognized as a revolutionary class movement. In answer to the inquiry is whether Kautsky should replace the word, quote, communism for, quote, socialism, end quote, in the title of the book, Geschichte des Sozialismus, which Kautsky was writing with Bernstein, Engels answered that the word, quote, communism, end quote, was not, quote, generally suitable, end quote, allgemein passend. Quote, communism, end quote, had a narrower range of application than, quote, socialism, end quote, and its meaning was no longer self-explanatory since it had been little used in the past 30 years. While Engels accepted the fact that the usage of the words in question changed, Engels' personal linguistic preference seemed to remain unaltered. See Kautsky's letter to Engels, 7th of February, and Engels' reply of 13th of February, 1894. In Kautsky's Friedrich Engels Briefwechsel mit Karl Kautsky. End footnote. When Marx achieved a wide reputation and high prestige in the international workers' movement, Marx conceded that in the utopias of Fourier and Owen there was also a pleasant and prepossessing aspect. Quote, the presentiment and imaginative expression of a new world, end quote. Marx, letter to Kugelmann, 9th of October, 1866. But Marx never admitted any affinity between his own views in utopian socialism and never withdrew his evaluation of utopian socialism as a modern mythology, a play with fancy pictures about the future, and in certain circumstances a mischievous nuisance. Footnote. Marx's attitude to, quote, utopian communism, end quote, to the communist conspiratorial groups of the 1840s was more sympathetic but ultimately differed little from his opinion on utopian socialism. The first communist sects consisted, as a rule, of the followers of Auguste Blanqui. They believed that the established governments could be overthrown by a surprise attack carried out by a group of resolute revolutionaries. Quote, Blanchism, end quote, wrote Sorel, quote, is in essence nothing more than the revolt of the poor conducted by a revolutionary staff, end quote. Parenthesis, la décomposition du Marxisme, end parenthesis. And that once this was accomplished, communism could be introduced at once. The members of the communist sects came from the artisans and highly skilled workers, but they did not ascribe any definite role to the working class as the architect of the communist revolution. For instance, Weitling did not recognize any role of an organized working class movement, and this, Weitling, not Weitling. It's going to be hard for me to correct myself on that. Weitling did not recognize any role of an organized working class movement, and this is one of the important causes of Weitling's quarrels and breaks with Marx, who greatly admired Weitling originally. End footnote. Its representatives and supporters were deluded by pretentious moral platitudes and intoxicated by futile daydreams about the sentimental reconciliation of contradictory class interests and the visionary elevation above the class struggle. For Marx, the belief implicit in the early socialist doctrines that the cooperation and goodwill of the bourgeoisie could be enlisted for the active support of social reconstruction was pure folly. Marx did not wish to have anything to do with such muddle-headed reformers and their fantastic program for the future. There were, however, important reasons for abolishing the sharp distinction between, quote, socialism and, quote, communism. In 19th century Europe, the communards gave the term, quote, communism, end quote, a sinister reputation, incomparably more threatening to the workers' movement than the abuse heaped upon communism in the 40s and 50s. Even in the Civil War in France, one can sense Marx's concern at the efforts of the European governments to cry down the International Workingmen's Association and its activity. Although the communards were drowned in blood by the troops under the command of the Versailles government, the victims of the massacre and not its perpetrators were presented to the world as responsible for unspeakable outrages and stood to pillory as a danger to civilization, order, and humanity. Marx might not have been impressed by this repute, which he tried his best to expose, and he was certainly not sensitive to popular views about the Paris Commune. Others, however, could not afford to ignore this state of affairs. The tragic end of the Paris Commune had added urgency and importance to the resolution passed at the Conference of the International, held in London in September 1871, which prohibited the use of any, quote, sectarian names such as, sectarian names such as positivist, mutualist, collectivist, and communist, end parenthesis. This resolution had not much to do with the Paris Commune, but it came at an opportune time when there was public outcry and condemnation of communism. Other developments events also favored the abandonment of the name, quote, communism and its replacement by, quote, socialism. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the differences of meaning between, quote, socialism and, quote, communism were disappearing. For socialism was increasingly purging itself of the utopian elements of the earlier socialist schools and acquiring what Marx described as the realistic outlook. On the European continent, the Paris Commune was not only the, quote, grave of the Proudhon school of socialism, end quote, but also of other sorts of non-Marxian socialism, at least until the end of the 19th century. Socialism was no longer a bourgeois but a working-class movement, more and more dominated by the doctrine of Marx, above all in Germany, but also in other countries of the continent of Europe. In 1895, Engels could write without exaggeration of the one great international army of socialists, quote, marching irresistibly on and growing daily in number, organization, discipline, insight, and certainty of victory, end quote. Engels, Preface to Class Struggles in France. Finally, the abandonment of the term, quote, communism, end quote, was of vital importance to the success of the social democratic movement in Imperial Germany. The change had probably been accepted not only out of necessity, but also as a symbol of the changed outlook. It reflected the determination not to resort to the tactics which produced the French disaster of 1871, and implied the repudiation either of armed insurrection or of the open advocacy of violence as a means of establishing socialism by a historical shortcut. In his famous introduction to Marx's class struggle in France, 1848 to 1850, Engels himself expressed his confidence in legality, in obtaining a socialist majority by vote, and in the defeat of the, quote, parties of order, end quote, which would perish under conditions created by themselves. Footnote, see Georg Lichtheim's Marxism. Both Marx and Engels intensely disliked the term social democracy. See Engels' letter to Marx of 16th of November 1864 and Marx's letter to Engels of the 18th of November 1864. According to Marx's definition, quote, social democracy, end quote, meant an alliance of bourgeois democrats and the workers under the banner of reformist socialism. As its career in the last 100 years has amply demonstrated, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, is a suggestive and in some respects felicitous expression of which Engels' practical mind must have been aware. Nearly 30 years after the first onslaught upon Karl Grün, the man who took it over from Proudhon and launched it upon its meteoric career, Engels set, quote, German scientific socialism, end quote, against Proudhonism, and referred to it again approvingly in his prefatory note to the third edition of The Peasant War in Germany, published in 1875. Quote, German scientific socialism, end quote, wrote Engels, is, quote, the only scientific socialism that has ever existed, end quote. And Engels soon began to use the once objectionable term more freely as the distinctive name of Marxian socialism. As the prefatory note to The Peasant War in Germany seems to indicate, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, meant at first as much as, quote, theoretical socialism, end quote, that is, a socialist doctrine based on or expressed in terms of a sociological theory. Footnote. Engels attributed to the, quote, sense of theory, end quote, notable as much in German philosophy as in the German workers and their leaders, and the achievements in advance of German socialism, and to the indifference toward all theory of the, quote, crawling progress, end quote, of the English working class movement. As a matter of fact, Engels felt that among other Western European nations, the English, the French, the Belgians, the Spaniards, and the Italians, only the Germans were capable of becoming scientific socialists. This opinion was shared by Marx, who wrote, quote, it must be admitted that the German proletariat is the theoretician of the European proletariat, as the English is its national economist, and the French proletariat its politician, end quote. Marx. End footnote. As the prefatory note to The Peasant War in Germany seems to indicate, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, meant at first as much as, quote, theoretical socialism, end quote, that is, a socialist doctrine based on, or expressed in terms of, a sociological theory. Before proceeding to the analysis of the various connotations of the concept of scientific socialism, it is perhaps worthwhile to refer briefly to the developments which restored, quote, communism, end quote, to its original prominence. It was Lenin who again abandoned the terms socialism and social democracy and replaced the terms socialism and social democracy with communism. Quote, the term, quote, social democracy, end quote, is scientifically incorrect, end quote. Lenin argued, because, quote, from capitalism mankind can pass directly only to socialism, end quote, and socialism in its true sense is but a lower stage of communism. Footnote. Lenin, The Task of the Proletariat in Our Revolution. End footnote. Lenin urged the change of the name of the party also for another reason, perhaps more important from his point of view. We must call ourselves a communist party, Lenin declared, just as Marx and Engels called themselves, to emphasize our distinctiveness from the Social Democrats, whose leaders throughout the world joined hands with the bourgeoisie. What distinguishes communism from social democracy is the rejection by social democracy of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Communism denotes a classless society, but, in a more general sense, also those forms of social and political organization which emerged during the transition period from capitalism to communism. As Lenin emphasized, in this period of transition, a great variety of political and social forms would appear, but their common characteristic would be the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In this sense, they would all be instances of communism. New section, section 2. The three connotations of the concept. Although Marx seems purposely to have avoided the use of the term, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, Marx was, of course, very familiar with its concept, which he himself developed. The connotation of this concept is not easy to define. Marx never did, and Engels used, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, in several related but distinct ways. For Lorenz von Stein, socialism was a theory, a system, a scientific trend, even a science, parenthesis, Wissenschaft, end parenthesis, rather than a social movement. Von Stein spoke of, quote, die sogenannte sozialistische Bewegung, end quote, parenthesis, the so-called socialist movement, end parenthesis, for there was hardly any evidence of socialism being at that time anything more than an intellectual trend initiated by middle-class writers and thinkers. Similarly, Karl Grun wrote in 1845 that, quote, there might be some isolated secret communist associations, but it was ridiculous to speak of a communist party, end quote. And Louis Ribot spoke of the communist sects constantly quarreling with each other. This situation changed entirely during Marx and Engels' lifetime, and the socialist movement grew into strong and well-organized parties in many European countries. Marx made a sharp and clear distinction between socialism as an emancipation movement of the proletariat and as a set of sociological, economic, and historical assumptions underlying the program of the socialist movement. Numerous passages in Anti-Düring clearly testify that Engels did not confuse them either. To Marx, the distinction was of philosophical importance. Already in economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx emphasized that history is not only what actually happened in history, but also the consciousness of the process of becoming, the comprehension of the immanent purpose of the historical world process, and its movement toward a preordained goal. Communism is this immanent purpose that is realized in history, and the awareness of its, quote, necessary pattern and dynamic principle, end quote. It is that system towards which the whole of history has been heading, and which would reverse the institutions and invert the values of the past. Theoretically, we read in the Communist Manifesto, the communists, quote, have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement, end quote. In other words, the communists are not carried away in an unknown direction by an elemental pressure of social events, but are always fully aware of where they are going and what their final destination is. Footnote. The importance attached by Marx to, quote, the ultimate aim of socialism, end quote, explains the indignation aroused by Bernstein's famous position, quote, to me, the ultimate aim of socialism is nothing but the movement is nothing, but the movement is everything. End quote, Bernstein. End footnote. The point which Marx was anxious to emphasize was that his theory of socialism coincided with the evolution of society. He did not invent his theory of society and history because he felt that without it a man would be lost in the fortuity of vast and complicated events, or because he was moved by moral considerations, as were many other socialist doctrines reviewed in the Communist Manifesto. Marx's own theory was not the invention of a reformer, but the result of a generalization based upon the observation of historical and social change, quote, going on under our very eyes, end quote, and upon a, quote, critical knowledge, end quote, of a movement inherent in social reality, which by itself was producing the material conditions of the emancipation of the working class. It was rooted in and discovered from the flow of human affairs. It was, quote, the theoretical expression, end quote, of Engels put it, quote, of the proletarian movement, end quote. Marxian socialism was scientific because Marxian socialism was in agreement with reality, reflected reality's momentum, and explained the nature and trend of change. Because it was scientific, Marxian socialism gave to its adherents a sense of direction and purpose. It imparted, to quote Engels again, quote, to the now oppressed proletarian class, a full knowledge of the conditions of the meaning and of the meaning of the momentous act the proletarian class is called upon to accomplish, end quote. Engels. Anteduring. In order to distinguish and to clarify the various meanings in which, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, has been used by Marx's followers, it is important to take note of the fact that for Engels, and of course for Marx too, scientific socialism was one of the results of their search for the concept of social science and for an all-inclusive sociological theory. To make a science of socialism, socialism had first to be placed upon a real basis, wrote Engels in Anteduring. Engels understood by this real basis a theoretical social science, which as has been mentioned earlier, Marx called the, quote, science of man, end quote, or the, quote, natural science about man, end quote, and Engels the, quote, science of society, end quote, parenthesis, Wissenschaft der Gesellschaft, end parenthesis. Footnote. Marx seems to have taken up the German equivalent of Saint-Simon's term, quote, la science de l'homme, end parenthesis, which occurs, for instance, in the title of the memoir sur la science de l'homme, published in 1813. Karl Grun's expression, quote, die menschliche Wissenschaft, end quote, parenthesis, the human science, end parenthesis, is clearly Saint-Simonist in its origin. Engels probably adopted the term, quote, Wissenschaft der Gesellschaft, end quote, from Lorenz von Stein, and used it frequently in his book Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs. The Comtean term, quote, la physique sociale, end quote, parenthesis, social physics, end parenthesis, end quote, la physiologie de l'espèce, parenthesis, the physiology of the species, end parenthesis, are not to be found either in Marx or in Engels, which might indicate their dislike of the reductive materialism suggested by the French expressions. End footnote. This theoretical social science was to be essentially historical and to combine the ideas of Hegel and Comte. Quote, "The history of society in all its branches," end quote, wrote Engels, is coextensive with, quote, "the totality of all sciences which occupy themselves with human beings," parenthesis, "and divine," end parenthesis, end quote. Or as he said elsewhere, quote, "the science of society," end quote, is, quote, "the sum total of the so-called historical and philosophical sciences," end quote. When Engels spoke of, quote, "the sum total of the so-called historical and philosophical sciences," end quote, he seemed to have some kind of Hegelian encyclopedia in mind which would combine and coordinate the science of government, jurisprudence, political economy, the historical sciences, the study of art, religion, and philosophy. On the other hand, Marx's science of man and Engels', quote, "totality of all sciences which occupy themselves with human beings," end quote, are close to Comte's social physics, parenthesis, la physique sociale, end parenthesis. Comte defined his social physics as, quote, "the study of the collective development of the human species," end quote, whose task is to coordinate the social past and to determine the order which the march of civilization tends to produce. The social science, as envisaged by Comte, Marx, and Engels, was a study of social man, man within society in all man's manifestations, a natural history of man and a history of civilization that unfolds itself in conformity to a necessary law of evolution. The distinction between a utopian and a scientific socialism was closely related to the search for a science of society. For the utopian, socialism was, quote, "the, quote, expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice," end quote, and needed only to be discovered, quote, "to conquer all the world by virtue of its own power," end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. And the scientific socialist strove to base socialism on a theoretical foundation, on the knowledge of historical and sociological laws. The distinction under discussion goes back to the young Comte's Système de politique positive, parenthesis, 1822, end parenthesis, and even to Saint-Simon, in spite of the tag, quote, "utopian," end quote, attached to him by Marx and Engels. Already Lorenz von Stein observed that Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonists raised socialism to the level of a Weltanschauung, by which he wished to say that Saint-Simon and his followers associated the advance towards socialism with certain universal trends in the development of society. Karl Grun put it very neatly when he wrote that Saint-Simon, quote, "searched for the organic law of human existence in order to arrange this existence in accordance with the law," end quote. As a matter of fact, Saint-Simon said explicitly that a, quote, "social system cannot be created," end quote. Man can only adapt himself to the necessary course of development and remove obstacles barring its march forward. Comte took advantage of his law of the three stages to differentiate between the utopian approach to political problems, characteristic for the theological and metaphysical stage, and the scientific approach associated with the positive stage of the intellectual development. Utopian political thinking takes no account of the state of civilization and looks for the best possible social order, irrespective of the existing circumstances. Scientific thinking accepts the fact that social organization is determined by the state of civilization and that the progress of civilization is subject to invariable laws. Since the law of civilization cannot be eluded, political action can produce no durable results unless it is exerted in the same direction as the force of civilization and unless it aims at producing changes which this force necessitates. Karl Grun was not entirely wrong when he asserted that, quote, Saint-Simonism contained scientific socialism, end quote. For Saint-Simonism had a theoretical foundation, however inadequate it might have been from the Marxian point of view, a set of sociological assumptions and laws whose operation was to bring socialism about. This is one of the meanings given by Engels to, quote, scientific socialism, end quote. Marx could find fault with Karl Grun for many reasons, but the misapplication of the term, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, should not have been included among them. In Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels described the real basis, which made of socialism a science, in terms of a Weltanschauung. The view of the world underlying scientific socialism is dialectic and not metaphysical, evolutionary and not static, as we would say today. With this conception of nature, there was closely associated a corresponding conception of history. History was not considered as, quote, a crude heap of irrationality and violence, end quote, but as, quote, the process of evolution of humanity, end quote, which takes place in conformity to laws. Socialism became a science, Engels continued, with two great discoveries: the materialist conception of history and the theory of capitalist production as the process of the appropriation of surplus value by the capitalist. Modern scientific socialism is based on the discovery of these two important facts. They constitute, Engels wrote, quote, a scientific foundation, end quote, of Engels' own and Marx's views. Plekhanov was familiar with this neutral meaning of scientific socialism. Plekhanov emphasized that, quote, the founders of scientific socialism showed us in the development of the productive forces and their struggle against backward, quote, social conditions of production, end quote, the great principle of the variation of species of social organization, end quote. Footnote. The quoted passage follows directly the comparison of Marx's achievement in the social sciences with that of Darwin in biology. End footnote. Elsewhere, Plekhanov identified scientific socialism with the recognition of the inexorable laws of social development. They entail the historical inevitability in the succession of the various stages through which a society has to pass in its advance, and which, in Marx's words, cannot be cleared by leaps, but only shortened in their passage by appropriate activity. In the same context, Plekhanov mentioned quite a different meaning of scientific socialism, closely connected with that just considered. Quote, for us, end quote, Plekhanov wrote, quote, the desirable arises from the necessary, end quote. Plekhanov. The neutral concept of scientific socialism can be found in Lenin's early writings. Marx found it impossible to content himself with utopian socialism. Quote, he did not confine himself to describing the existing system, to judging the existing system, and condemning the existing system. Marx gave a scientific explanation of the existing system, end quote. Consequently, by an objective analysis of the capitalist system, Marx is able to prove, quote, the necessity of its transformation into the socialist system, end quote. But as in the case of Plekhanov, a different element is associated with this neutral concept. Quote, if ideals are not based on facts, end quote, Lenin observed, quote, ideals will only remain pious wishes, with no chance of being accepted by the masses and hence of being realized, end quote. The concept of scientific socialism, in its neutral meaning, can be found not only among Russian but also among Western followers of Marx, although almost exclusively in Germany and Austria. Edward Bernstein distinguished between the theoretical foundation of socialism, which consists of universally valid knowledge, and the socialist program, which is related to the theoretical foundation in a similar way as in applied science as an applied science to a pure science. In this sense, the socialist program is capable of objective proof and rests on something stronger than a moral impulse, a mere desire or opinion. The same distinction seems to underlie August Bebel's definition of socialism. Quote, socialism is applied science in all avenues of human activity, end quote. August Bebel. The second meaning of scientific socialism is derived from the predictive power of the Marxian theory. The sociological and historical laws, which form the theoretical foundation of socialism, constitute the basis for the predictions about the course of social evolution in the future. Saint-Simon and Comte were the first thinkers to maintain that prediction is an important function of knowledge. Quote, "The true, the positive knowledge consists in predicting the development of events with which one is concerned," end quote, wrote Saint-Simon. And on this account, Saint-Simon found that history provided no adequate positive knowledge. The historians were clearly unable to say, quote, "This is what will result from what had occurred. This is the order of the universe which civilization will bring about," end quote, and generally to deduce the future from the past. But the lack of success on the part of the historians does not prove that once the past is rightly ordered, we could not discover the trends and characteristics of the social future. The predictive power of history is based on the fact that the, quote, "future consists of the last term of a series whose first terms constitute the past," end quote. When one studies carefully the first terms of a series, it is not difficult to discover the following terms of a series, and thus to, quote, "deduce the future from a proper observation of the past," end quote. Saint-Simon. The young Comte adopted and developed the Saint-Simonist idea. He defined prediction as a deduction of a particular case from a universal law of succession, and maintained that a determination of the future should be recognized as the proper function, as much of political science and sociology as of natural science. Quote, "It is quite in accordance with the nature of the human mind that observation of the past should reveal the future of politics as it has done in astronomy, physics, chemistry, and physiology," end quote. In acknowledging predictability as an important criterion of knowledge, Engels was clearly in debt to positivist philosophy. "The materialist conception of history," wrote Engels, "is of supreme significance for the socialist outlook, for it not only provides a, quote, "natural and reasonable explanation," end quote, for what happened in the past, but also serves as a basis for extrapolation and prediction of what is bound to happen in the future. Socialism became a science, for the coming of socialism could be inferred from the laws operating within a socio-economic foundation. Socialism became a science, for the coming of socialism could be inferred from the laws operating within a socio-economic formation, and from the laws of succession of distinct socio-economic formations in the course of history. Karl Kautsky emphasized that these glimpses into the future conditions of society are not mere expectations. They let us see which states of society are necessary and must come. The predictive power of the Marxian theories are emphasized by Plekhanov and in particular by Lenin. Marx deduced, quote, "the inevitability of the transformation of capitalist society into socialist society wholly and exclusively from the economic law of the development of contemporary society," end quote. Lenin. As Lenin put it elsewhere, the demonstration of the inevitability of socialism, resulting from the materialist conception of history, constitutes an essential part of the meaning to be attached to scientific socialism. That it is its predictive power which makes socialism scientific was also the view of many other perceptive students of Marx. According to Benedetto Croce, historical necessity is essentially associated with the Marxian theory and allowed Marx to prophesy the coming of the new era. Karl Kautsky derided the view as though scientific socialism were concerned with the painting of a future state of society. Scientific socialism's basic task was to show how the socialist society would come into being as a, quote, "outgrowth of the whole past and present history," end quote. Karl Popper agreed in substance with this evaluation, but stated it more incisively. Marx saw his specific mission in extricating socialism from socialism's sentimental associations, socialism's visionary background, socialism's unrealistic assumptions, and in establishing socialism upon the basis of scientific method and scientific prediction. The development of socialism from socialism's utopian to socialism's scientific stage implied that socialism, quote, was to be based upon a study of historical causes and historical effects, and finally upon the prophecy of its own advent, end quote. Pauper, open society. The third meaning in which Engels used the concept of scientific socialism was concerned with the existence of class divisions and the inevitability of class struggle. According to Marx, socialism is bound to remain utopian or doctrinaire as long as it, quote, does away with the revolutionary struggle of the classes and its requirements by small conjurer's tricks or great sentimentality, end quote. Marx, Class Struggle in France. The doctrine of class war is an indispensable component part of socialism, for otherwise when the class struggle is pushed aside, quote, nothing remains as a basis for socialism but, quote, true love of humanity, end quote, an empty phraseology about, quote, justice, end quote, end quote. Footnote. Marx and Engels' letter to August Bebel, Wilhelm Liebknecht, and W. Braca, and others of the 17th to 18th of September, 1879. In the opening sentence of his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels observed that modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition that society is increasingly split up into two hostile camps and rent by the class struggle between capitalists and wage workers. In the course of a further analysis, Engels reached the conclusion that socialism was, quote, the necessary outcome of the struggle between ... the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, end quote. Once this view was formulated, the task of socialism was no longer, quote, to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historico-economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict, end quote. Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Socialism became a science with the discovery of the class divisions and antagonism where the motive force, Socialism became a science with the discovery that the class divisions and antagonism were the motive force of the social development, quote, capable of becoming, end quote, as Lenin put it, quote, the creator of a new society, end quote. Lenin. The three sources and three component parts of Marxism. Footnote. In connection with this particular meaning of, quote, scientific, end quote, socialism, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, see R.C. Tucker, quote, The Cunning of Reason in Hegel and Marx, end quote, and G.D.H. Cole's The Meaning of Marxism. End footnote. Not only the recognition of the reality of class war, but also the attribution of the liberating mission to the proletariat is an essential characteristic of scientific socialism. According to Marx, quote, the proletariat alone is a rarely revolutionary class, end quote, and, quote, holds the future in its hands, end quote. To ascribe to the proletariat this historic role is not to consider the proletarians as gods. The condition of life of the proletariat drive it to revolt against the inhuman conditions of life of society as a whole, for the proletariat cannot free itself without abolishing altogether the inhuman conditions of social life which are reflected in its own situation. A class is revolutionary, Marx argued, if that class, quote, finds the content and the material of that class's revolutionary activity directly in its own situation, end quote. That is, if it is able to see the measures which are directly dictated by its situation and which ought to be taken in any circumstances. Once the class acquires this ability, quote, the consequences of its own deeds drive it on, end quote. Marx. Footnote. A revolutionary class may not, however, attain the necessary level of knowledge about that revolutionary class's position in the social world, and being potentially a revolutionary class, still remains incapable of accomplishing that class's own revolution. In Class Struggle in France, Marx tried to show that this was what actually happened in France, At the time, the French proletariat was still unequal to the French proletariat's revolutionary task. End footnote. The inevitability which, according to Marx, compels the proletariat to assume its historic task is not, however, a natural necessity resulting from a succession of events in conformity to law, but a dialectical inevitability derived by the young Marx from the Hegelian logic of the negation and later preserved as an ideology of redemption. Marx's belief in the liberating mission of the working class is not scientific but eschatological. It does not belong to the realm of natural regularities, and there is no place for it in scientific socialism in its neutral meaning. When Edward Bernstein appealed for a greater sense of realism because the working men, quote, have the virtues and failings of the economic and social conditions under which they live, and neither these conditions nor their effects can be put aside from one day to another, end quote, Bernstein was a lonely voice and was disowned by the orthodoxy. But in the end, Bernstein's view prevailed in many parts of the world, not only as a more realistic, but also as more humane. Section 3. The naturalistic fallacy and the semantical confusion. If the socialism of Marx were described as scientific only because of its theoretical, sociological, and historical basis, parenthesis, the materialist conception of history, the predictive power of this conception, and the doctrine of class struggle, end quote, the claim that Marx discovered scientific socialism would not be entirely out of place. Marx's doctrine could be rightly regarded as scientific socialism on account of having a theoretical foundation which, as Marx and Engels maintained, rested upon experience and which showed that socialism must come in accordance with the laws of social evolution. The right way of challenging the claim of Marx's socialism being scientific would not consist in questioning the appropriateness of the term scientific, but in testing its factual credentials, that is, the empirical validity of the theoretical foundation upon which scientific socialism is based. This would still leave unanswered and unexplained the question as to why Marx's doctrine should be described as scientific socialism, parenthesis, unless, quote, socialism, end quote, is to mean only, quote, sociological theory, end quote, but neither Marx and Engels nor their followers ever suggested this synonymity, end parenthesis. Socialism is not a natural event taking place in conformity to law, like a sunrise or an eclipse of the moon. Nobody would dream of setting up a party which would strive with knowledge and sense of purpose to assist the rising of the sun or an ellipse of the moon. However, such a party has been set up over and over again in different parts of the world to bring socialism about. If the advent of socialism is an inevitable event, it would be silly and absurd to say that people should exert themselves to bring it about. The silliness and absurdity of this demand are due to the fact that a certain stage of affairs is considered as both necessary, come what may, and as an event to be affected by what people do or fail to do. On the other hand, if socialism is not a mere natural event that occurs in accordance with the law, and if its coming may, unlike the rising of the sun or the eclipse of the moon, be promoted or impeded, speeded or delayed, by what people do or fail to do, its advent is neither strictly determined, nor is it predictable, and to speak of scientific socialism is as absurd as to speak of socialist astronomy. According to Marx's uses of the term, quote, according to Marx's uses of this term, quote, socialism, end quote, stands for one of the distinct stages in the evolution of human civilization, of which four, Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production could be distinguished in the past. Socialism is the new epoch which is to follow, in conformity to the historical laws of succession, the capitalist formation, in whose womb it was born and in which it matures. But socialism also denotes the vision of a future state of society, based on equality and justice and offering to all the full and unhampered development of their human qualities and potentialities. In this latter sense, socialism is not a neutral and scientific science to me. In this latter sense, socialism is not a neutral and scientific, but a value-loaded and ethical idea. If these two essentially different uses of, quote, socialism, end quote, the evolutionary and the moral concept of it, are not kept clearly apart, we are bound to fall victim to the fallacy of equivocation. For the failure to distinguish them confuses, quote, socialism, end quote, in the sense of a morally desirable ideal, which socialism as the mere name of the next stage of social evolution, and leads to the conclusion that socialism, as the future state of society, is not only what has to be, but also what ought to be. On the one hand, socialism is what must come in conformity to the historical and sociological laws which determine the succession of the progressive epochs in social development. On the other, socialism is what ought to come in accordance with our sense of right and wrong. Footnote: a similar jump from a statement of fact to an ethical claim is to be found in Comte. See D.G. Charlton, Positivist Thought in France. End footnote. As a matter of fact, Marx did not always manage to hold the two concepts of socialism distinct. As some scholars have said, a dualism runs through the whole work of Marx. A, quote, dualism which consists in this, that the work aims at being a scientific inquiry and also at proving a theory laid down long before its drafting. A formula lies at the basis of it, in which the result to which the exposition should lead is fixed beforehand. End quote. It is hardly possible to disagree with this view. Everyone who reads Marx must sense the moral impulse, the indignation with the misery, exploitation, and oppression of the workers which led him to socialism. It has rightly been pointed out over and over again that Marx's investigation of the facts of economic life was subordinate to his main purpose, which was to demonstrate that the transformation of capitalism was a necessary condition of the abolition of social evils and of the emancipation of man. The messianic inspiration of Marx preceded the economic argument which came later to justify the original expectation. Striving for the proof of the inevitability of the revolution, Marx made of his theory a means to an end, an instrument for producing the right kind of prophecy. Footnote: see A. L. Harris, Utopian Elements in Marx's Thought, and J. L. Talman's book, Political Messianism. Marx also assumed that he established the inevitability of the transition. End footnote. Marx also assumed that he established the inevitability of the transition from capitalism to socialism in conformity with his, quote, economic law of motion of modern society, end quote, that is, with a natural law. Marx confused socialism in the evolutionary and neutral meaning of this term with socialism in its moral sense, without being aware that judgments of value influence his statement of fact. Marx shared this fallacy with other social thinkers of his time, with Saint-Simon and Comte in particular. Their vision of the future interfered with their investigation of the social world, shaped the sociological and historical laws discovered in the present, and thus endowed the laws with the power of producing the envisioned future. According to another interpretation of Marx's doctrine, the above criticism rests upon a misconception. There is no unknowing confusion in Marx's procedure, for Marx, like Hegel, quote, flatly rejected, end quote, the distinction between statements of fact and statements of value. Quote, judgments of fact cannot be sharply distinguished from those of value. All one's judgments are conditioned by practical activity in a given social milieu. One's view as to what one believes to exist and what one wishes to do with it modify each other. End quote. Asaya Berlin, Karl Marx. See also R.C. Tucker's The Cunning of Reason in article The Cunning of Reason in Hegel and Marx, and R. Heiss's Die großen Dialectiker des 19. Jahrhunderts. That valuation is a constitutive rather than a restrictive factor in the knowledge of social facts in general, and of human activity in particular. and that in this kind of knowledge, observation, and value judgment are inextricably bound up, is a basic assumption of what in the Russian philosophy of the 19th century was called the, quote, subjective method, end quote. See V.V. Zenkovsky's History of Russian Philosophy. When Plekhanov and Lenin subjected the subjective method to a severe criticism in their polemics against Mikhailovsky, Lenin and Plekhanov were attacking Mikhailovsky's personalism and not his rejection of the dualism of facts and norms. In the latter respect, there was no difference between Mikhailovsky and Mikhailovsky's critics. End footnote. One second. It is often felt, I don't know if I said end footnote, but end footnote, it is often felt that the Marxian critique of ideologies derives its strength and power of persuasion from laying bare the impact and distortions wrought upon statements of fact by ideological, that is, by value statements. According to the second interpretation of the Marxian position, Marx saw no error in reversing this procedure and deducing the criteria of moral evaluation or the moral principles from empirical statements about matters of fact. Irrespective of how we may judge Marx's historicist moral theory, the merger of the evolutionary and moral means of the term, quote, socialism, end quote, has been responsible for much confusion about the sense and significance of scientific socialism. It led to an entirely erroneous belief implicitly involved in what Marx and Engels said on the subject, that Marx was not only able to demonstrate the inevitable advent of socialism, but also to show that what ought to be also had to be. Edward Bernstein was the first to point out this fallacy, but his discovery was greatly resented by the socialists at the time. Footnote. The political consequences of this belief culminate in the, quote, logical inevitability of revisionism, culminating in the, quote, logical inevitability of revisionism, end quote, are analyzed in Z.A. Jordan's article, Philosophical Background of Revisionism in Poland. End footnote. Another footnote. Edward Bernstein, Die Voraussetzungen des Sozialismus und die Aufgaben der Sozialdemokratie, last chapter, and Wie ist wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus möglich? Karl Kautsky both accepted and denied the existence of the fallacy. Quote, the materialist conception of history, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, has taught us that we should deduce our social aims exclusively from our knowledge of the given material conditions, end quote. On the other hand, Kautsky maintained that socialists cannot do without a moral ideal in their fight against the exploitation and class oppression, and added that, quote, this ideal has nothing to do with scientific socialism, end quote. End footnote. That the rules or norms of moral conduct can never be derived from facts, and that they are man-made in the sense, quote, that we must blame nobody but ourselves for them, neither nature nor God, end quote, is a statement with a powerful logical argument in its favor. It is true, of course, that facts are not entirely irrelevant to the rules of conduct. A norm which would be incompatible with the laws of nature is not practicable and enforceable. Since we accept that rule ought implies can, we cannot without contradiction blame anybody for having failed to do what he was not free to have done, or for having done what he could not avoid doing. In this sense, a moral theory must have its basis in facts. Facts are not, however, decisive. Facts restrict our freedom of choice in adopting the rules of conduct, but do not determine it. There is no logical relation between descriptive and evaluating statements, and the latter cannot be reduced to the former. We alone are responsible for the standards by means of which we pass value judgments, compare one norm or another, and assign a variable degree of excellence to human conduct. Quote, the standards are not to be found in nature. Nature consists of facts and of regularities, and is in itself neither moral nor immoral. It is we who impose our standards upon nature, and who in this way introduce morals into the natural world, in spite of the fact that we are part of this world. End quote. Karl Popper, Open Society. The view about the dependence of the moral norms upon facts, which is sometimes described as moral positivism and ascribed to Marx, is the exact opposite of the above-defined doctrine of the autonomy of morals. The certainty of scientific socialism that what ought to be also had to be is a methodological misunderstanding and misapprehension based upon the naturalistic fallacy, that is, upon the belief of the deducibility of norms and values from facts. The certainty of scientific socialism also results from the confusion of semantical categories. Quote, scientific socialism, end quote, is as semantically ill-formed an expression as is, quote, square circle, end quote, quote, socialist astronomy, end quote, or, quote, moral physics, end quote, whose semantical appropriateness is recognizable at once by everybody. New section, section 4. The reassertion of utopian socialism. The socialism in the moral and evolutionary sense will coincide one day, according to Marx, not a hope but a demonstrable truth. But no theory can demonstrate that what is inevitable is also morally desirable, for no moral decision is deducible from the knowledge of facts. We cannot help accepting as a matter of fact what is brought into existence according to a law operating through natural processes. This does not imply, however, that what has to be is thus transformed into what our moral consciousness demands. Whether we should morally accept what is inevitable remains a moral problem, and its solution is our own responsibility. It was probably a redemptive ideology that prompted Marx to transform a socialist program based on a scientific foundation into scientific socialism, which thus acquired an air of utopianism. Utopianism is an excessive moral idealism and an unjustifiable reliance on proselytism, education, and moral persuasion as a means of accomplishing a prompt passage from strife and misery to universal well-being and harmony. But we do not escape utopianism, Edward Bernstein observed, if we ascribe to the present what we wish to be the case in the future. Marx did not hope for an instantaneous change as the utopians did, but the difference between them was one of degree rather than of substance. Marx's moral radicalism made him expect a complete transformation of institutions, of ideas and habits, of the patterns of interaction and of the spiritual climate, which was to take place under the impact of his evolutionary determinism. It is true to say that Marx did not justify the coming of socialism on moral grounds, but on the basis of a law of social development. However, having justified the coming of socialism on the basis of his evolutionary theory, Marx claimed that the law of social development realizes moral aspirations. Scientific socialism confuses the construction of a theory of social evolution, that is, an intellectual act, with the realization of a social ideal, which requires a sustained effort of the will. Scientific socialism did not establish the belief that what the future brings is both historically inevitable and morally desirable as a demonstrable truth. It reached this conclusion by an intellectual shortcut and by an eschatological conversion of hope into certainty. Since this intellectual shortcut contributed to the accumulation of misunderstandings about the proper function of the will and the intellect in the realization of socialism, it led to the errors of voluntarism and to the reduction of the intellect to a mere tool of the will. The concept of scientific socialism leads to the misconception that socialism as an ideal can be identified with a set of theoretical propositions which are capable of demonstration. It is easy to see that this is a misconception. Once it is defined in terms of ultimate values, socialism is inconceivable without applying both the relationship of cause and effect and the relation of aims and means in the examination of the development of events. To choose rationally the best means for the attainment of a given aim is a question of knowledge, but the decision to adopt the rationally chosen means is not dependent upon it. Generally, it can be safely assumed that where values and ideals are concerned, reason cannot prevail without the participation of the will. To ignore this requirement is to attribute an undue role to reason and to err by an excess of intellectualism. Intellectualism is an error as fateful for the realization of socialism as that of voluntarism, which ignores the part to be played by knowledge in its attainment. Okay. That is the end of Chapter 13, The Concept of Scientific Socialism, from Z.A. Jordan's Dialectical Materialism, The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, a philosophical and sociological analysis. Thank you so much for listening. The next video, if you want to keep listening to this, is going to be the conclusion. Chapter 13 was the final chapter of the book. Thank you.